Well, as I said, I'm a kind of lapsed computational neuroscientist, which means that now being in the philosophy department allows me to look into brains without actually always have to look at brains. Previously, my professor was always annoyed when there was a non-brain on my screen. He said, "Anders, you're slacking off." Now it can be anything on my screen, and it's very hard to tell whether I'm slacking off or not. Quite often my boss actually gets suspicious when there is a brain on my screen, because that's usually a sign that I'm not actually working on the most important projects. But fortunately, he's not here. So, in general, the philosophers are interested in looking at the limits of the possible. Meanwhile, science is more interested in looking at what limits of what's real, and engineers are interested in pushing the limits of what's feasible. So this talk is going to kind of jump a little bit between these three approaches. So I'm going to be thinking about interfacing brains, both from a kind of practical engineering perspective, from a scientific perspective, what might actually be physically possible in the near or longer-term future, and then from a philosophical standpoint, okay, what might be the outer limits of this, and especially the outer ethical limits, what ought we be doing, or what ought we not to be doing. But to get started, brain interfaces. Actually, it's a good question what an interface really is. And a typical definition you find in computer science textbooks is that an interface, that's a point of contact between two systems. And typically, they have a well-defined input and output hardware of some kind, or in the case of software interfaces, there might actually be a well-defined software interface. And in particular, they have a protocol. It's not just that this USB socket needs to be shaped enough to fit into the suitable computer or device. It must also obey the kind of communication codes that's in the USB standard. And as most of us recognize, that already imposes a lot of interesting problems. USB sockets practically never fit in the first try. You need to turn them 3 times. And that's, of course, obviously because they are some kind of fermions. And similarly, of course, when you plug them in, quite often your computer or your device start complaining because it's the wrong version or it doesn't recognize the plug-and-play software and so on. Now, let's think about what it would go into actually plugging and playing with the brain. That's going to be an interesting question, because first we need to define some suitable interface in the physical sense, and we also need to have the right kind of protocols. And then, ideally, the things at both ends of this system should be agreeing with each other what we're going to be talking about. On the other hand, the use of the word interface has been around for quite a long time. We're talking about man-machine interface, and it's been quite important, of course, to shape objects so they work well with humans. If you think about it, an everyday tool like a pen or a knife has quite a well-thought-out interface to fit with the human hand. And over generations, people have been inventing better ways of doing that. A few decades ago, people started formalizing that, and we got the science of ergonomics that tried to figure out actually what kind of interfaces work best with humans. And as we got more and more complex software, this turned into a pretty important topic actually. So one reason why so many gadgets around us today are an Apple gadget is simply that they very early on realized that, oh, if we spend some time thinking up a good design that actually fulfills some of those basic ergonomic principles people in the industry have been going on about for quite a long while, the users might actually get very happy. So if you go back to the 80s, there was this set of beautiful white books about the Apple standard interfaces, both for the software but also how things were supposed to work for the user. And the result was, of course, Macintosh products tended to look the same, different applications had the same style, they were very instantly recognizable. Meanwhile, over in Windows and PC world, everything looked like whatever the programmer had come up with that morning. So it was quite hard to use skills you learned in one program from next. So this was a very clever realization, but that little design trick helped the company quite a lot. Partially, they have kind of lost it in some domains. I could go off on a big rant about iTunes being a kind of crime against everything that was in those white books about proper programming interface design. But let's continue on something much more cheerful. Then there is, of course, the classic area of cybernetics. So this also came about when people started thinking about control of systems. But you have feedback control in servo motors and servo systems, you have early electronic control systems, and maybe you could apply the same thing to what's happening in animals. When you get hungry, you get a drive to eat. And the more you eat, the less hungry you are, so eventually you will stop eating. Maybe we could actually treat that as a control mechanism. So the cybernetics, as it emerged in the 50s and 60s, was kind of thinking of the view that, okay, different kinds of machines seem to fulfill the same mathematical principles of control. Maybe that's applicable to animals and humans, and then that had a lot of lovely synergy with the emerging field of artificial intelligence in the West, where it eventually kind of got subsumed and they ended up the meanings of it very different. Meanwhile, in the East Bloc, it became a slightly different field where we moved much more to a mathematical view. And of course, most of us today think of cybernetics as cool cyber implants your character has in some science fiction role-playing game or Arnold Schwarzenegger in the movies. Because the idea of actually putting implants into the body, although that's very old, it kind of got coined in cybernetics, or rather it came from the cyborg, Manfred Kleins, who were thinking about how could we actually adapt astronauts to living in space, realized that we can apply this and try to modify their bodies to fit space rather than try to make a spaceship that works well. And that's of course a bit of a tension here, whether you should make a spaceship that is very nice for the Earth and adapted humans, or whether you should modify the human and actually turn the spaceship into part of the astronaut, or even make the astronaut the spaceship itself. And from a cybernetic standpoint, that's a kind of an obvious thing to think about, because you're thinking about the whole system. You don't care about one fleshy lump, no, you think about the spaceship and the astronaut as a system for doing space exploration. A bit like how certain architects said that a house, that's a machine for living. And on one level I think that's a completely correct view. On the other hand, most of us don't like living in houses built in that ethos. However, these ideas have kind of been going on, and the nice thing about the cybernetic worldview is that it actually makes you realize that a lot of the things going on here are information processing. So it might actually be not too weird to think of a USB interface to the brain. After all, we got another big interface from the brain, and that's the body. The body is in many ways acting as the brain's interface to the world. It takes in sensory information, translates this sensory information using our eyes and my skin and so on into neural signals, which are the only kind of signals the brain actually gets. And when the brain signals back in the only way it actually can signal, through neural firing, which then gets transduced out in the muscles, where it gets translated into muscle movement, which allows me to act on the real world. So again, you can say that my body is actually just a big, bulky and rather weird interface. It's not too different actually from that USB port. It's slightly more complicated though. Okay, let's go on. Of course, we can try to extend our bodies in interesting ways. So thinking about how we can upgrade ourselves, we can do peripheral interface. We can take stuff and add on top of it. So in this case, this was probably during the Second World War, where people were interested in listening for enemy airplanes. I've never been convinced that this wasn't a kind of red herring to confuse possible German spies, so they didn't notice those radar installations that were actually doing a lot of the job. But there are a lot of very amusing pictures from this era of these weird, not just extra giant ears, but enormous parabolic antennas that then go to tubes you can put your ears in, and apparently hear for a very far distance. So the fun thing... What?
Some of them still exist.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think down there at Dunkirk they have some weird listening constructions, concrete parabolas, where if you stand in the right spot you can kind of hear any aircraft that happens to be in the right direction. At least that's the idea. And the fun part is, if you actually were to use this, I think very quickly your brain would start viewing these extra ears as a kind of extension of your ears. Because our brains are very, very adaptive. After all, they don't know from the start what kind of body they're plugged into. There is actually a series of very classical experiments where people took the ferret and rerouted the visual nerve from where it would normally have entered the cerebral cortex in the visual area to the auditory area. If you do this on a sufficiently young ferret, it will indeed learn to see using the areas it normally uses for hearing. And if you do microimaging and so on, you can check that actually that part of the brain got formatted roughly like you would expect from the formatting of a visual part. It seems like the cerebral cortex is essentially a generic learning system. So whatever in a sense you plug in there, if you do it early enough, it can organize itself for it. This is quite interesting and mildly scary given that we live in an environment that might be biasing our learning in a lot of fun ways. And of course one can play around with this cortical map. So this is Penfield's classical experiments from the 30s. He needed to do some surgery on some people and figure out exactly what he could cut out. And that wouldn't cause very nasty damage. So he used local anesthesia and then did some mild electric stimulation, different part of the brain, and asked the patient, what happens, what do you feel now? And that way you could kind of do the first maps of, okay, that seems to be in the fingertips. Okay, that seems to be the hand, and so on and so on. Of course, in the modern era we got more colorful illustrations, but basically it's the same thing, but now you can use more advanced brain imaging, or actually do a lot of handwork still. So you can't read any of this text, which is kind of good because it's pretty boring, but basically this shows the tonotopic map. That's in the auditory system of rat, I think in this case. So the color here denotes which frequency in this part of the brain reacts the most to. So you can kind of map out. You play a sound to the ear of an animal, and then you see where you get the most activation. The interesting thing is that if the animal, for example, has become deaf at high frequencies, so then you get a reorganization. They actually, the area where it can hear expands into the area that doesn't get any new signals. After all those unused neurons are sitting there not doing anything good. So let's use them for something constructive. And it's interesting because this means that it actually gets better abilities in the areas where it actually can hear. And this has been demonstrated in a lot of senses. Blind humans, for example, seem to be using what we seeing people are using our visual cortex for. In their case, they seem to be using advanced touch. So you can actually create a bit of neural noise by using transcranial magnetic stimulation. And at that point, they've been reporting that, oh, the braille text I was reading just got fuzzy. But that's actually because their so-called visual area now got confused. So they have been reusing that part of the brain to increase the sense of touch. So this is, of course, very good news. And we can even modulate this to some degree. The one to the right here is an experiment where we have put an electrode into nucleus basalis, one of those little core nuclei that send a lot of neurotransmitters to the rest of the brain. And this one seems to be very important for affecting both attention and learning. So you can kind of use that to send a signal, and then the brain becomes plastic, so you can more easily train it. So you can actually rearrange this map a bit by kind of sending right signals or don't right signals. So that might be an interesting application, of course, for neural interfaces, except that most of us probably don't want electrodes down there in the really core part of our midbrain.
So yeah. What decides what part of a brain gets assigned to what function? Because that's fairly consistent across people, right?
So that seems to be because the brain nerves get located where they are. So I don't know the exact developmental genetics for how the visual nerve ends up connecting to the back of the brain, but it does that at an early age, and those signals start formatting the visual cortex even before you're born. There are actually some random firings you get in the retina that seems to start to organize the network, and of course as soon as the baby is born and starts seeing things, you get an awful lot of reorganization. And in rare cases, apparently, you can get the wrong router, but it's fairly rare because it happens on such an early stage that if you mess that up, well, even more vital systems are going to be seriously messed up. But in theory, you could imagine rerouting everything and get a completely different setup. Exactly how well that setup would work is another matter. There have been some interesting papers arguing that our brain areas actually have a connectivity that kind of minimizes the wiring length. So if you look at do a permutation of brain areas and calculate the amount of connectivity between different areas, it seems like it wouldn't work very well. Now I'm suspicious about this because this might be a problem that has a lot of local minima. It might be just that there is nothing similar to our brain, but a completely different arrangement, which might lead perhaps to a slightly different perceptual world too, might actually be doing it equally well. All right, so what can we do with this? Well, of course, we can play around in extending our body. So this is the Australian artist Stellark. So he's always been interested in messing with the body. He started his career by using little fishhook and wires to hang himself naked across the street. And then been continuing hanging himself higher and higher up on bigger and bigger streets and getting into more and more trouble over that. Of course, in America, the biggest problem is, oh, there's a naked man hanging up there. The fishhooks, no, that's not a problem, but he's naked. And meanwhile, over in Europe, of course, oh, he might hurt himself, that's not good. But after a while, of course, the novelty wore off, and he went into actually playing around with making various additions to his body. So the most interesting part he's got here is his third arm. Right now, I think he's just wearing it in that picture straight out, but it's actually connected to muscle sensors. So it can, he can partially control it using his other arm. So when he twists his wrist, it actually twists its wrist twice as much. And the fingers end in little grippers, which are controlled by muscle impulses from the stomach. I don't know how much control he actually got over it. He's clattering quite a lot. Generally, his performances are very, very loud. He loves making loud stuff. But he's able to actually use his free arms to write the words at the same time. Assuming they have 6 letters and they train a lot of it. Because it's obviously not very easy to actually use. It's mostly art, it's not practical. Similarly, he got this hexapod walker that reacts to his leg movements, so he can kind of walk with it. It's very impressive, it's very loud, and it's probably quite dangerous. But obviously we can take signals from the peripheral part of the body and use that to control things. And in some cases we might be using it for interesting and useful things. And of course our body model probably changes. So generally I have an egocentric space around me where I refer to things in relation to myself and my body. And then there is the allocentric space where you're sitting right now, which is kind of I got a coordinate system, but it's not me-centered anymore. I have a sense of it, you in relation to the room. Now the interesting thing is you can measure that using various forms of brain scanning and checking how people react. But when you give people a rod, the distance where you shift from egocentric to allocentric space changes. And this happens in humans and it happens in rats. If you actually give rats extended whiskers, so you get kind of super whiskers, they also change the view of the size and relationships in the world. Suddenly, the rat regards itself as bigger. Cats also use whiskers apparently to figure out exactly what space they can get through, because the whiskers have the same width as the head. Which means that a cat, if you cut short its whiskers, I wouldn't exactly recommend this, I would find it deeply unethical, but it would probably be very fun, would tend to get stuck a lot. And I heard anecdotes along these lines. So we're using a lot of aspects of our body actually for processing, and the difference between our minds and our bodies is actually quite fleeting. So Stellark is probably feeling much bigger there once he got these extra legs and going, which probably explains a bit why he's so fond of having these enormous loud and extrovert things going on. And then of course we can put stuff inside. So this is my friend Todd Huffman's finger, and he's getting a magnet implanted. So it's a typical neodymium magnet covered with silicone, and once it's inside his finger, he of course becomes sensitive to magnetic fields. At the very least he can lift very small objects like paper clips, but the more interesting thing is of course it's moving in reaction to magnetic fields in the environment. So you can move it across a laptop and feel where the hard drive magnets are, for example. On good days he can detect that there is a current in an electric wire from the oscillating magnetic field. He reported that when he was touching a frying pan on an induction stove, he felt that, oh, it's vibrating magnetically but not mechanically. The interesting thing here is the magnet is essentially just a passive mechanical transducer that takes a magnetic field and turns it into a bit of vibration and pressure, which is detected by his normal tactile sensors in his fingertip. It's just that up there in the brain, of course, we probably are going to have a little bit of reorganization going on, because now that fingertip gets signals that are very different from the normal signals he gets when he touches things. So you can distinguish between magnetic and non-magnetic things. Other people have tried the same thing over at the Kevin Warwick's group down in Reading, of course. We're all very happy to try this out. And they even published a paper where you can see some of the sensitivity. It seems like they're mostly sensitive to kind of 300 hertz vibrations. they don't really react well to really high frequency vibration, but they definitely can feel electric motors in the vicinity. They also have, well, you can't see this in the diagrams, just trust me, they also indeed do have a pretty good sensitivity for weak magnetic fields. Of course, whether this is useful for anything or is another matter. We're going to get back to that question, what's the use of this? But it's an interesting demonstration that you can actually relatively easily extend the body, and then the brain starts to interpret these signals in a different way. Okay, let's go on here. And then of course we can cheat like these very cool University of Washington contact lenses. The idea is to actually be able to display stuff on the contact lens. So far we've kind of done enough to demonstrate that the principle works. Whether anybody will actually want to buy them enough to fund further research is another matter. But you could certainly imagine that some of these intimate interfaces actually might be used to interface quite readily. Other things, of course, of great practical importance is to use myoelectric signals from the muscles to control a prosthetic. And now people are also getting more and more interested in having prosthetics that send feedback by stimulating electrically the arm so you can also feel some form of touch. The dream would of course be to plug everything into the nervous system, but as we're going to see, that's a rather messy proposition. So this is probably from a practical standpoint where most effort is going to be. The interesting, cool effort that of course get a lot of military money is the more futuristic stuff about plugging it into the nervous system. But a lot of people who actually use prosthetics, they realize that, oh, that hand that looks very plausible, that's not as useful as a hook. A hook can be surprisingly effective actually. Which gets back to this problem about who are we designing different tools and interfaces for. Quite often a lot of this is interesting from a scientific perspective or a transhumanist perspective, but might not be terribly useful if you actually have to live with the whole device. For example, people with electric arm prosthetics quite often have trouble with the batteries running out. Which is not a problem we have with a normal arm or a truly dumb one, but if you have a battery that can run out, or that it starts malfunctioning in an oscillating magnetic field, things might turn a little bit embarrassing. Okay, let's get into the brain instead. So, we're still not breaching the skin here. We might be using the classic method from the 30s, Berger, who got interested in the electric field the working brain produced. So he started out thinking that this would be the key to telepathy. I don't think we've gotten there yet. But he kind of set up the basic system. You put electrodes on the scalp, you use various amplifiers and a bit of electronic trickery to get rid of noise. Because the big problem is, of course, that we're talking about microvolts here. And then every time you blink, you're getting a signals in the millivolt range from the muscles around the eye that can kind of completely swamping out the signal. So this is a pretty tough signal processing problem. And then you have these caps with the electrodes in a particular system which have kind of become a medical tradition, so all the papers are following that standard. And then you get these waves, which have certain regularities that are medically quite useful, and you can kind of tell what's going on roughly. It's a bit like listening to the traffic in the city. You can hear whether it's rush hour or not. You can kind of tell apart. Okay, alpha waves. The subject is probably relaxing but still kind of awake. Okay, gamma waves and a little bit of beta waves. Yeah, now we're thinking really hard. Okay, delta waves. They fell asleep again. The question is, of course, how much we can use this for. So here is a nice system. So this is a commercial system from G-Tech. They have been selling it around. So you have a cap with electrodes, and again the problem is of course getting nice connections here. Both people have a wonderful advantage here. But still, the skin is amazingly insulating. It's not just that it's insulating, it's also having some rather tough properties in terms of inductance and other electrical properties. I had a teacher in medical engineering who really hated skin. He was always talking about it in very harsh ways. Oh, rub it off, yes, get rid of it, yes, put the stuff under it, you get much better connection there. He seemed to be a bit sadistic about it. The problem is, of course, if you want to invite people, let's say, at a conference to try it, you can't do that. And you can't shave them either. So then you take these electrodes and connect it to a computer. And these days, of course, we have enough computing power to run it. You just need a little box with all the electronics, which can be made fairly cheaply, but in practice, of course, since it's medical grade, it's ridiculously expensive. but amateurs, of course, can build stuff rather cheaply, and there are various games that also have EEG measurements, but usually just using 2 or 3 channels. And then you can use this for interesting ways. So this is their product to help people who are profoundly paralyzed to spell out things. So what it does is that first it shows a line, it lights up a line, and then a column, and then another line, a column. And it does this more or less randomly. And you focus on one letter you want it to spell out. Now, what is happening is when you get a certain kind of stimuli, there is a characteristic pattern in the brain waves. They're called evoked potentials. When something happens, you get typically, especially if you average a lot of different trials, the same response. So there is, for example, the P300 response where you kind of react or recognize something. So introducing something like that, I forgot exactly which response it is. So when you're focusing on the D, for example, whenever it lights up, you get a particular result, and after 10 trials it can kind of guess, oh, it probably wants a D. And then it continues. When I was watching this demo, it looked very impressive, although after 5 minutes they still hadn't been able to spell out hell. That's the sad part. And the main problem was, of course, this was in central London, so the electric fields from all the yuppies and journalists with cell phones and everything else, the electrosmog was completely swamping the signals. So the EEG interfaces are very nice because, well, we understand it fairly well, but you have low bandwidth, you get an average of what's going on across square centimeters of cortex containing millions of neurons, and there's an awful lot of noise. That's a bit sad. Still, you can use them for fun stuff. This was another conference where you had an orchestra using EEG, heart rhythm and other things to produce sound. I wouldn't exactly call it music. They kind of cheated by having sampled pieces of music and various video things. It was very much modern art. Conceptually very interesting, but perhaps not the most aesthetic experience I ever had. But fun. And of course, you can use this for other things. So one question is, can you use this as a good lie detector? People have been trying to make a better lie detector ever since it was clear that the original polygraph was worthless. And these methods are probably also pretty worthless, but they're involving the brain. And everything that you can put neuro as a prefix on tends to get money these days. Sad but true. It's a kind of a current hype prefix. Once upon a time it would have been cyber, and in a few years it might be something else. So one of the methods called brain fingerprinting consists of using this P300 response. You show a suspect in a crime case a number of possible murder weapons. But of course you as the policeman, you know that that particular murder weapon is the one. If the witness actually is the killer, he should also be reacting and noting that's the knife I was killing with, none of the others. So there should be a typical there should be some difference when he sees that particular knife. And then you go through a lot of evidence this way. Now, does this actually work? Well, there is no real good papers supporting it. Except that it's a commercial product that's been used, not just that police force have bought it, but it's actually been used in some cases. It hasn't been really well received in the US, but some courts have seriously considered it. It might be useful to demonstrate that I don't know anything. I can't recognize the murder weapon or the victim or anything that you claim I should be recognizing. But in India there has been a case where somebody actually got convicted for murder due to evidence from this kind of system. And a lot of people are very concerned because the science is not in yet. This doesn't seem to work reliably enough. It wouldn't be surprising if it turned out that some brains are measurable this way, some brains aren't. There might be a lot of interesting aspects of discrimination. Not to mention, of course, that it would be very easy to create suggestions and manipulate people with this. On the other hand, that's of course why a lot of police forces love it. They also love polygraphs and other suggestions of that this is a lie detector. Even the myth that policemen know that when you're lying or not is very useful. Because if you think that the guy interrogating you will tell whether you're lying or not, you're not going to be lying as much. So,
placebo, is it?
Yeah, it's a placebo effect. It's called the pipeline to truth effect. So there is one anecdote that there was an unusually stupid criminal that the police just put next to a photocopier, put a colander on his head and said, this is a lie detector. And every time they believed he was lying, they pressed copying on the button, and they had put a sheet of paper saying lie with an exclamation mark. You're lying! And according to the story, he immediately confessed. Yep. I don't know whether this is true. It's too good a story to actually check the truth of. But yeah, I can certainly imagine people falling for it. So you can get a surprising amount of information out of even this fairly simple data. Then of course we might want to get more deep data. So another way of getting stuff from the brain is the fact that we're fairly transparent in the infrared. So you might have noticed on television whenever characters are in hospital these days, or if you've been unlucky to actually be in the hospital, these little clips they put on the fingers. And that's not to keep the patient from running away. That's actually a very elegant solution where you send an infrared laser through the finger. Now, if blood is oxygenated or not, that changes its absorption in the infrared spectrum. So essentially you're taking a little spectrogram through the finger. This pulse oximeter is really good for measuring whether somebody is not getting enough blood circulation, whether the oxygen level are going down. Either they're in big medical trouble or it slipped off. In any case, you need to go in there and check them. And this has saved a lot of lives. It's a beautiful piece of very simple technology. And it can even check whether it slipped off because you get normal oscillations in the absorbance because of the pulse and so on. So it's very elegant. Now, could we do this through the head? Well, it turns out that actually, yeah, some infrared gets through even the cranium. So you can actually use sensitive detectors to detect activation. So in this particular paper, they were looking at people either getting a little bit of tactile stimuli to their fingers or tapping their fingers. And they could tell apart the regions across the central sulcus that this was happening on. Of course, we needed to put the detector rather close to that particular area of the brain, and I think they did this for quite a long while. I think they did this for almost an hour, different tests. So I wouldn't exactly be using this to control a car or anything. But in theory, you can actually measure things by infrared through the head. The nice thing is you don't need to breach the skin, no risk for infection, just need a lot of scary-looking optical sensors on it. Another approach is, of course, the magnetic resonance imaging, which essentially are using the same thing. You're looking at the differences that occur in the brain when the blood is oxygenated or not. Parts of the brain that are working rather hard are supposedly depleting the oxygen level, and you should be seeing a change. Of course, nothing is that simple in reality. This was the kind of basic theory, and everybody were really hoping this was true because a lot of papers were starting to be based on it. It actually turns out to be mostly true. Essentially, neural activity causes blood vessels to dilate. You get changes in oxygen levels that produce the so-called bolt response that we're looking at in the functional magnetic imaging. Which is a wonderful topic which I could go on for ages about, but I'm going to try to get to do a real brain interface. However, this is probably the big breakthrough, I think, in neuroscience in the sense that now we're getting big amounts of data about all sorts of activities in the brain. Now we're actually getting to the point where we can start thinking about how can we actually make useful statistics of it. So in the 90s, a lot of the big battles were actually more about how to interpret these activations. Now we have kind of solved the first level of statistical problems. Now we get into the problem that, okay, we see some kind of activation there. What does that actually tell us? Because an activation in a part of the area might mean that there is coming a lot of inputs to it. It might not mean that it's actually doing anything. But at least it's giving us hints that something is going on when you do this or that. And then you need to do an awful lot of processing, which might be mildly problematic. Because different test subjects have brains that look differently. So typically you morph them to a standard brain, and a lot of information might get lost here. And some people might have an individual brain that works very differently. We just don't know, and there is a risk of losing that kind of data, of course, when we do all this morphing. But it can be used for interesting things. So this is a fairly recent paper, which in many ways wasn't doing anything extraordinarily new. It's just a nice combination of magnetic resonance imaging and a bit of computer learning. So they showed people movie clips, and then they kind of learned how the brain responded to pictures in the visual cortex. And then they showed an unknown movie clip to test subjects, and we got an activation pattern, the visual cortex, and then we tried to average together other movie clips to get an activation pattern that in the model of how the brain works that fitted it. So that picture, well, that's the reconstruction of from the brain. Not exactly the same, but you kind of get a blob in the right place. In that case, it's very clearly a person in the right place and so on. The elephant turns into a blob in the right place. So this one is rather cool because you can actually see it as an animation, which is mildly hard to understand. But basically, we're going to be showing the main clip that's actually shown here, and this is the reconstructions in 3 test subjects. And these ones, there are other movies that get averaged together from the library. They're kind of acting as base functions, if you want to be technical about it. But as you can see, in real time, it does notice that there are objects in roughly the right part of the picture. And at least it seems that humans tend to be recognized much better, actually. You do get some characteristic thing there. But that is just because a lot of these movies contain humans, so you get good examples to average together. Or whether it's because the visual cortex is particularly tuned to recognize humans, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. So from a technical standpoint, this wasn't too amazing, but of course it looks pretty good.
The visual cortex is fine-tuned to recognize faces, right?
Not necessarily V1. So we know that the fusiform face area is supposedly really doing it, because there we find neurons that get really active whenever you see a face. The primary visual cortex, I don't think anybody really believes it's tuned straight for faces, although that wouldn't exactly surprise me.
According to V1,
yeah. I would be interested in seeing what happen if you get from the fusiform face area, although I think from a kind of practical standpoint it's a tough region to actually get a good image of.
Especially if you're not doing non-invasive.
Yeah. But of course if you go invasive then you can get even more fun stuff. There exist celebrity neurons in the hippocampus. In some people you can find a Tom Cruise neuron. So you essentially show the person after you install the electrode pictures of different people, and then you find that some neurons react only to a particular person. They probably react, of course, to a lot of other stimuli that you haven't shown them, but you get an enormous kind of sensitivity to very specific stimuli in the hippocampus. It's a kind of very compressed representation. So that Tom Cruise neuron might also react to the concept of a green day or the planet Jupiter, but, well, you can't really test for that. So they just tested with a lot of celebrities, and that worked very well. Well, in any case, we can, of course, try to get a bit deeper. So my teacher, who was didn't like the skin, this is his favorite method. So this is the corticoelectrogram. You actually put the EEG electrodes not directly on the brain, but close to it. You open up the skull and put it on. And the video doesn't work on my computer, but it's a rather fun example where they had a task where the test subject is looking at different places on a screen. They get a little target to look at, and then they use electrical activity to predict where he will be looking, so they can actually track that. So these electrodes are pretty good at doing the tracking. But now, of course, now we have a good signal, but now we need a lot of computer learning in between to turn that into something useful.
Yeah, is that human?
Yeah, that's a human. Yeah, so they have been working on grasping motions too. So they are very interested. This is actually from, I think, Imperial. So maybe we should invite some of their...
Is this normal human?
Well, a normal sick human...
I was just wondering about the ethical permission to do this experiment, how you open up.
Yeah, well, first you just need a desperate grad student. Yeah, and that apply a little bit of pressure. Yeah. Well, normally this kind of thing, you have somebody who simply needs to have some surgery. So those celebrity neurons I was mentioning earlier, you can't just plug in an interface into your hippocampus just because you want to check those neurons. So typically what's happening is when you get temporal lobe epilepsy, if it's really serious, you need to resect that part of the brain that is causing the epileptic seizures. And you don't want to remove the wrong part of the brain anywhere, but particularly not, of course, close to the hippocampus, because you might seriously mess up memory, or the amygdala, because then you might seriously mess up emotion. So you really want to figure out that very closely where the part that you want to get rid of is. So this is again the same reason why Penfield did his experiments. He also needed to figure out exactly where the damaged area was. So in this case I would imagine that they put that in mainly to actually figure out where are the epileptic locus and then get rid of it. But of course we got out a bundle of papers in between too. So everybody happy hopefully. But yeah, it's an interesting ethical problem. I'm going to return to this. How much can we do in the name of science and medicine and pure exploration? Then we got to deep brain interfaces, and now we're getting, of course, to the real thing here. So essentially you're using a pacemaker-like construction that you implant under the skin, because you don't want anything to go through the skin, because then it can get infected, and there are bacteria everywhere just waiting for messing up things. Not to mention that the body also has a lot of very strong opinions about stuff going through the skin and is trying to expel it and do all sorts of nasty stuff. Normally when you do engineering you assume that the environment might be a bit harsh, but not necessarily that the environment is out to get you. The exception is of course if you do security engineering. In the case of implants you need to do the same thing. Well, you have an immune system that is doing its best to get rid of you. You need to fool it or do something that really it can't deal with. Or sometimes a bit of both. So titanium, for example, has this nice property that the body actually thinks that looks a bit like bone. Titanium dioxide is sufficiently bone-like that you can fool actually the body to grow onto it. So typically you get a layer of fibroblasts surrounding this mechanism. And then you put a wire from this little pacemaker with a battery and control mechanism up to the right part of the brain. So this has been typically used to deal with Parkinson's disease. So there is a whole genre you can find if you go online and Google for films showing somebody who's having serious tremors, and then they take a magnet and kind of activate it and it goes off. And they walk normal, and they walk freely and so on. When you turn it on again, they can't really move. It's very much, it's interesting also from kind of cultural standpoint, these little films, because on one hand it's kind of those old-fashioned let's laugh at the cripple films. But at the same time, it's almost religious thing. Hallelujah, modern technology saves the day. He gets well just by activating that little device. It's very cheering. I met many people who have been profoundly inspired by seeing that. Mostly, of course, because if I take a pill to cure my disease, you're not going to notice anything for weeks. And in many cases, very subtle. Here you get a very sudden transition. The problem is, of course, you're plugging, essentially you're sending a current through a rather sensitive part of a piece of electronics to change its behavior. It's a bit like a radio that's mildly broken, and then you just plug in a battery a little bit at random, and then you figure out that if I do it there, it actually starts working better. It's a fairly crude method, which is sad. We can improve on this in a lot of interesting ways, and that's actually happening. There is interesting research about having sensors and even try to just respond to the signals. For example, there is some research here done by Tipo Assis and Dr. Stein about pain. So people with chronic pain have a problem that the periaqueductal grey substance, PAG, seem to be getting in some kind of weird oscillatory loops. Now these loops produce a mental state which is very nasty and painful. Now if you send in a signal that kind of disrupts the loop, the pain goes away. So ideally you might want to, instead of just sending in a big current, you actually kind of just affect these loops. You have a little learning system, so a little neurochip, and then kick it out of the bad behavior. So this might be very useful. Okay. Well, and then of course you might use it for sinister purpose. This is a classic in the annals of mad science. José Delgado, a Spanish neuroscientist who was playing around with this back in the 70s, and he implanted a remote control deep brain stimulator in the lateral hypothalamus of a bull. The lateral hypothalamus is involved in aggression. And then he dressed up like a matador, and in front of a lot of journalists he went out there, and there comes the bull charging, and he got a remote control, and the bull is now happy and doesn't do anything, and he's charging! He's happy. Yeah. In terms of public relations stunts, this is amazing. In terms of sheer stupidity, it's also amazing. After all, we're talking about Spain. He's insulting the national sport. Yeah. in front of all the journalists. And in the rest of the world, of course, his talk about that we should have a psycho-optimized society sounded very, very sinister, especially given that it was still a fascist military regime in Spain and so on. I think he's still alive, and I think he's still saying vaguely sinister things about this. So if you Google him, you're going to find an endless amount of websites from paranoid schizophrenics who think that they've been implanted by this. But to be fair, you could do it. If you really wanted to mess with somebody, you could do this kind of implant. It's just that it's rather hard to hide the fact that you got a pacemaker-like construction that needs to be activated with a magnetic field. But yeah. Okay, let's go. Of course, we can send and receive signals in a bit more fine resolution. So this is a typical electrode array, where we take a bundle of little electrodes, usually tetrodes, so we actually got 4 contacts. And this is pretty small, so you plug it into the cortex, and then you can record from it. You can do it in the peripheral nervous system. Professor Kevin Warwick is still boasting very much about that experiment, but you can do it in the central nervous system, and then you can receive the signals roughly like from a brain pacemaker, and you can do interesting things with them, like controlling robotic arms. So this is Miguel Nicolelis, or rather his monkey. Miguel Nicolelis is a very cool neuroscientist who always managed to get football into every talk because he's Brazilian. But he's also been doing a lot of nice work at Duke University of actually having monkeys learn how to control robotic arms. So that way, the biggest problem is that monkeys get terribly distracted when they see robotic arms because they're scary. Especially if you're a small monkey, of course. So at least in the early stage of the project, the robotic arms were outside in another room and were doing stuff. And then the monkey got rewarded if he managed to pick up something. The monkey didn't realize that. But basically, you can actually set up things. So monkeys and mice and, well, in principle, humans too can learn how to use these ones. One interesting note he made was that this is a complex learning system because it's the machine, the computer that interprets the neural impulses, is using a learning algorithm to try to figure out if that activity pattern happens and the monkey moves on that way, okay, I should have a mapping between them. So trying to figure out the mapping from neural activity pattern to motion.
Sorry, Anders, I missed that. The interface, how is the interface here?
So it's an electrode array implanted in the motor cortex. Yeah, in the primary motor cortex. You can do it in the supplementary motor cortex, which is interesting because that's where a bit of motor planning is happening. And I think this is an interesting issue. Do you want it directly in the primary system? Then it's kind of connected to what you're doing right now. But you might want, of course, to have an interface that predicts what you're going to be doing. Training is going to be much tougher, but it might be much more useful. The interesting thing about this system is that it's learning how to map the real motor actions of the monkey from electric activity to a motion of a real arm, and then it uses that on a robotic arm. Meanwhile, when you set this up so the monkey gets rewarded for reaching something using the robot, mainly grabbing, let's say, a banana, then of course the monkey is going to start to learn too. So you have 2 learning systems plugged into each other. And what's actually going on here, nobody really understands. So Miguel has been arguing that actually maybe there is no real neural code. All the systems of the brain are kind of making it up as they go along. Everything is learning and adapting to everything else, which is an interesting and rather scary idea. But in any case, this is actually giving us pretty good data about how much signal we need, for example, to do good prosthetics. It turns out to be not that many signals we need in order to do a decent amount of robotic dexterity. But more work is needed. Recently I managed to train rats to see in infrared. I have no clue how he did that. I haven't read the paper yet, but he was twittering about it. It's worth following. In any case, you might of course go even further. So this is kind of a bit more futuristic. Of course, try to make those electrodes or chip surfaces delightful for the neurons. Cover them with polylysin or something else the neurons like to grow on, and then have it grow across it and listen into the conversation. So send an impulse into those little transistors and get the neurons to fire. So there's a lot of work going on about this. The problem is, of course, the usual kind of trial and error. Now you need to deal not just with the messiness of material science and microelectronics, but the messiness of neurons that might decide to do whatever we want to. However, neurons are gregarious, so this is a neural tissue culture, and these little spherical blobs here, the grey ones, that's the somas, the centers of the cells. And then they send out bundles, and they nicely bundle together, and actually like to connect to these black electrodes. So this is a fairly standard setup now. It's not too hard to get a lot of these cells, but of course you get a random wiring. The next step is figuring out how to get them to organize into something that does something useful. Again, Professor Warwick is running a tissue culture like this one to control robots and giving them some reward signals. And that actually seems to be getting some very, very simple behaviors out of them. Which I think is amazing, because there is absolutely no order up here. So it's kind of randomly connected neurons learning how to control a robot through the robot's very limited senses. But yeah, it's going to be a tough and interesting problem to actually get neurons to do what we want them to. But of course, once we figure out how to do this kind of tissue culture, maybe we can do a tissue culture of tame neurons, and then implant that so the tame neurons can kind of act as the interface between our silicon and the brain. All right, let's go on. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but we got optogenetics. Everything is more fun when you do genetic modifications, of course. So this is an area which I'm, as a transhumanist, I feel a bit embarrassed about, because I'm a neuroscientist, I'm a transhumanist, I like thinking about this kind of weird new technology that really matter, and this one kind of crept up on me, and I didn't notice it until just 2 years ago. And then I realized, what? It's been going on right under my nose. So it's a very obvious and simple thing in retrospect. You can transfect cells to express different new genes. You can put in genes which either have fluorescence, like in this case. So here you get fluorescence when in certain places of the brain. Or you might put in genes which are light sensitive. Essentially the photoreceptor we got in the eyes. And then you can connect, for example, those light sensitive proteins to ion channels in the cell membrane, which will then open or close depending on light. So then, of course, you just shine laser light on these neurons and they will start firing. Or if you connect it to another gene, they will stop firing. So you can essentially set up a little an interface that takes light signals and turns them into electrical signals. Even more cool, you can put this under the control of other genes which are expressed in certain parts of the brain or certain kinds of neurons. So the big name in optogenetics, Gero Miesenböck, who happens to be a professor around here, so you might consider inviting him, he's always fun. But this is a very cool thing, and this might getting around some of the problems with electrical interfaces, because now you don't have those nasty electrical fields you get around the sharp electrodes. Yeah, so this might be the future, we might actually be getting very bright brains. Then, of course, very interesting problem that you don't want to expose these brains if they become light sensitive to any other light. Then you might get some very weird problems. Another cool thing that was discussed at a meeting recently was, of course, well, you can actually try to put these viruses that transfect this into a kind of pill, or more properly an injection. You get them to transfect part of the brain and then express it just in one important part. Let's say the basal ganglia, which are the area you're concerned with when you're doing Parkinson. And then you might just put in a fiber optic cable and shine the right kind of laser light. So now you essentially got deep brain stimulation in a pill, as they call it. It haven't been done yet, but it looks promising. Another project at Imperial involves trying to transfect cells in the retina in blind people. They lost their photoreceptors, but let's make new ones that we can then send the right kind of laser to and signal into it. That's an ongoing project. It's going to be a while before it's tested out, but it looks promising. And the most interesting thing is, of course, now you're going to have cameras on a set of glasses, sending laser light into the eyes, and those glasses are essentially, you can program them to do any kind of image processing, which means that you could have apps doing all sorts of fun stuff here. I was vaguely involved in an art project but never got funding, that were to make kind of artworks based on hypothetical apps for blind people with optogenetic upgrades. I can't imagine why I didn't get any funding, but well, one day I'm hoping to be an app designer. And of course you might imagine doing this already for people with cochlear implants, which are already widely used and very effective. There is a very good book, Rebuild, How Becoming Part Machine Made Me More Human by Michael Korost, where he describes his experience of getting a cochlear implant. In the first chapter, which is absolutely horrifying, he describes the experience of going totally deaf in a very inconvenient situation in the middle of nowhere, and the lack of communication and how that is really problematic. In the rest of the book, he describes his experience of getting the implant installed, learning how to hear again, learning how to hear through software, trying to decide which kind of software to run, how do I want reality to sound. And in an absolutely beautiful passage, he's listening to some music using his implant. He connected his MP3 player to the input port of the transmitter. So now the music is going straight from the chip into the AD converter, being sent into his nervous system. There is no sound in the room, he's listening to music anyway. It's a beautiful little section. It's a very interesting case. And of course you could imagine all sorts of other cool interfaces here. Maybe you could have an ultrasound interface. The only problem is of course that the implants are not very good yet. So you wouldn't want to let go of your normal hearing in favor of this. But if you already had an impairment, it might be an interesting possibility. All right, how am I doing with time? I have no clue, actually. Yes, you set the clock. Okay, yeah, I've already been talking far too long, so let's rush through and see what, and kind of give you a few highlights for further discussions. Okay, so basically what I think we're all dreaming about is something like this. We want to have that little device we can nicely plug in and then use to access everything. The problem is, of course, we might be more likely to get something that doesn't work quite as well. We're in many ways already extending ourselves. We're not exactly cyborgs, but we're certainly cyborgs, functional cyborgs, that we have outsourced a lot of our mental functions. I can't remember my schedule. It's somewhere in the cloud, kept by Google. And then I'm getting it by this gadget, which is almost a part of my mind, except that it's out of batteries right now. And that's of course the little problem here. What does it take for something to actually become useful and widely used? Well, first it needs to be, we need to have access, we need to have done the basic science. And we need to have enough precision. We need to actually be able to activate the right parts of the brain to do whatever we want it to. And then it needs to be reliable. And that's something that you rarely hear people talk about, how well does these things work. So, for example, the transfixion of optogenetics, that seems to last a few months, then it disappears, and you need to do it again. Some of these other big implants, well, you don't want to go around with hardware in your body for too long, although some of them do last for years. And then there is the interesting problem of practicability. You want the safety to be really good. You want the cost to go down, it needs to be persistent, and it needs to be easy to use. We want to have this kind of Apple interface rather than something really complicated to use. So the problem is, of course, that we won't get anything that's popular until the benefit outweighs the cost. Or maybe the hype outweighs the evidence. That's always a problem when you have cool technology. Sometimes it's just cool enough that we get it without actually caring too much whether it actually works. There is an awful lot of placebo technology in our society. So in the case of doing therapy, treating illnesses, I think people are willing to take quite a lot of risk if the benefit is good enough. It's enhancement on the other hand. We don't want to have any too big risks if we get an enhancement. The benefit has to outweigh the risk. And then we have an interesting category, that's extensions like those magnets, getting something entirely new. How does it feel to feel magnetic fields? I don't know. I can't know until I get that implanted. And maybe I'm going to recognize that, oh, that wasn't anything. Now I'm just risking infection in my magnet and I can't get anywhere close to big magnets. Oh dear. Or I might find that, oh, there are beautiful magnetic fields out there. I'm frolicking around transformator stations, seeing the beautiful oscillating magnetic fields. The interesting part here, it's subjective. We can't tell the benefit before doing it. It's kind of more exploratory. It might be, of course, if a lot of people do it and start telling the rest of us, oh, it's really great. Then we know for certain we should be doing it. But it might also be highly individual. Some people find beauty in magnetic fields, others don't. So in that case, it's very tough to actually do the proper ethics. So in general, what people actually want to enhance is also weird. So this is my favorite study on the ethics of enhancement. It's published in a marketing journal because it was easier to get ethics approval that way. Go figure. So they asked students about whether we would want to enhance different mental abilities if there was a pill to do it. And we also asked similar students, well, would you think that this trait is close to your core sense of self? So for example, kindness is regarded as very fundamental to a self. But people didn't really want to enhance that. Wakefulness, on the other hand, that's not really core me. That's just a basic function. A lot of people wanted to enhance in that. When Julian Savulescu heard that only 9% wanted to enhance with kindness, he exclaimed, "Oh, they're wrong!" And maybe they're wrong, but it's very telling that we have this kind of rather strong anti-correlation. We don't want to mess with things that are too close to our sense of self. And in the ethics literature about the implants, besides the obvious concerns about risk and so, a lot of people have been saying, oh, you shouldn't do any implants that change your core identity. Yeah. But nobody wants to change the core identity. So the only risk might be, of course, that you get accidental changes. However, people might not want to enhance things like social comfort, motivation and so on. And they just go for the kind of cool and cognitive functions. But even more interesting in this study, we also checked whether people were in favor of banning it across society. And now, of course, we can compare that to whether they want to enhance themselves with it and whether we should ban it or not. So in this area are the kind of core stuff that, well, people didn't really care about, and they didn't feel it was as much need to ban a kindness enhancement. Which is a weird thing, really. If you think it's a bad thing to mess with kindness itself, but you don't think it's worth banning. On the other hand, over here, you get stuff that people want themselves to get, but they think they should be bad. So, for example, rote memory and wakefulness. Oh, yes, they really want that, but no, we should ban it. And math ability, that was the thing that really people thought, oh, it would be horrible if it was a pill that did that. In this area, on the other hand, we didn't want to ban it. So here we find things like absent-mindedness, concentration, and foreign language ability. So apparently, the ability to speak French, that's safe. We don't need to ban that. A lot of this probably just goes to figure that, yeah, people are much more complicated. We have a complex technology to mess with, but we also have interesting issues that it interacts with our ethics in tricky ways. So let's see here. So in general, of course, one interesting problem with this is by putting implants or other interface into our brain, we become hackable. And it's actually started to become a problem. Those pacemakers are programmed by sending a sequence of magnetic signals using an induction coil. And it's possible, of course, if you're naughty, to send the wrong signals. Set a pacemaker on test mode and the victim is not going to be very happy. The test mode essentially uses weaker and weaker and weaker signals until the heart stops, and then it goes back. Very nasty if you don't expect that. And you can imagine all sorts of things. So now people have started finally thinking about maybe we should have a bit of security. If with a Wi-Fi connection, maybe it should be encrypted. What do you think about that? It might be a bit like the early days of internet. Why have passwords? Everybody here is in the same department anyway. But things change. So we might want to avoid ending up like the Ghost in the Shell, where everybody is using cyberbrains and nobody seems to have a proper firewall on them. And then, of course, there's an interesting aspect of autonomy. So we might, I think we all agree we have a right to control our own bodies. But that also seems to be that we should have a right to control our own implants. So these are prosthetics, but I think they're still rather fun. So this was today in the Daily Telegraph, a guy who's modified his prosthetic to contain a dock for his smartphone. And over there is a pimped out leg. So these days people don't want the prosthetic legs just to look boring. We've been seeing Pistorius with his really cool carbon fiber legs, and even though they might not be having those runners legs, we might be using a lot of nice coloring and make them look good. Now this is interesting because, of course, the tradition in medical ethics and medical technology is that patients should not be messing with medical equipment. There are quite a lot of rather strict rules against that. But, of course, when something becomes a part of our extended self, I think we do have a moral right to actually mess with it, just like we have a right to mess with our own bodies. And this is, of course, where some people disagree with me. This is going to be a fun area for bioethics, but I do think that sufficiently good neural implants, that's probably a sign that I should be wrapping up here. Halloween is approaching. The ghost of overdrawn talks are hinting something. But there is an interesting ethical issue here that we might actually want to fight for a right not to tinker with our implants. Similarly, we might be having interesting issues of blameworthiness. There have been cases of people with deep brain stimulation who become compulsive gamblers. because the basal ganglia are involved in behavioral inhibition and some aspect of risk estimation. So by certain medication or deep brain stimulation, you might actually end up doing bad behavior. Now, if I gamble away my fortune, are my family going to blame me or my implant? Well, I'm going to certainly blame the implant, of course, because that kind of gets me off the hook. And I think right now it's an interesting interaction. It gets even more complex, of course, if the implant is actually doing part of my cognition. If I have a little chip in my hippocampus helping me with my memory, and now I forget something really important. In that case, is it the manufacturer of the chip, is it me, or is it some combination? Normally, we tend to think that forgetfulness, that's kind of a bad character, although it's a slightly forgivable bad character. But if something is a hardware problem, if my hippocampus just gave up because it didn't have enough oxygen, well, in that case, it's kind of forgivable. That was medicine. But of course, in reality, there is no such good distinction. And the courts are going to get more information about this, and that's going to lead to some rather messed up court cases. Okay, let's see. Anything more? Social impact? Well, we have a really bad regulatory systems. We have people falling for all sorts of bad lie detection systems. We have the interesting possibility of wireheading. So in 54, olds implanted electrodes in the septal area of rats, and they got really happy about that. So we're willing to do anything to press buttons to give more stimulation. So why eat when you can actually get pure happiness? And of course, if we get to do brain hacking, there is an interesting problem. We don't want to hack our motivation system that way, most of us. But what about those who want to actually put themselves into a happiness loop? Or the more subtle thing, if I do some modification of our brain and start thinking, this is the best state one could possibly be in, I don't want to change it. And everybody else find me insufferably smug or something else. But I'm of course convinced that this is the best state. I'm definitely not going to change it, well, no matter what they say. So very interesting problem here where our different values can be implemented in technology and kind of feed back onto the brain holding those values. Then of course we got to the interesting issue of artificial intelligence. I don't have the time to get into it, but I think there's a kind of race going on whether we can enhance human intelligence faster than we get dangerous artificial intelligence, or whether we can kind of connect the human intelligence to artificial intelligence well enough that we actually get the best of both worlds. That's another interesting topic. But generally, I think what I've been showing here is kind of just a little tip of a very fun emerging iceberg. So thank you, and I'm happy to hear your questions.